In this video, we will learn about Redux and how we can use Redux with React. So typically in a React application, we do state management, wherein in our components, we define state. And suppose there is this component here and it needs to pass something down to this component here. So how would we do it? This component will pass it to its next component, to this next component, to the next component. So this means if we have these kind of complex structures in our components, this becomes a fairly complicated piece. And this is how state management would typically happen in React components. We would keep on passing them in props. How do we do it in Redux? In Redux, we have a store and all the components can connect to the store and use the state from the store. So the state is stored in a central store and all the components can connect to it. So note, we do not need to pass the state variables as props from the top to the bottom. What are the problems when we pass it in the top to the bottom model? If there is another component that comes in between or another field that has to be passed, we will need to go and change all the components in between. In this Redux model, all these components independently connect to this single store. So what is Redux? Redux is a JavaScript library for managing application state. Works on the principle of storing the entire state of the application in a single central store. This store can be accessed by all components. So like we saw here, there is a single store where we are storing the state and all the components can then connect to this store and get what they want. It's popularly used with all the JavaScript libraries and frameworks like React, Angular, Vue, because Redux is a JavaScript library and it's very popular for building user interfaces. To use Redux with React, we will do an npm install. We'll need to install Redux and React Redux. So these two things you need to install and then we can start using Redux. Why is Redux popular for React? As we discussed, in React, components have their own state, but they don't have an easy way to access another component's state. So if you want to access something from the state of the different component, we will need to pass it through props, and in the hierarchy we will need to continuously pass it through. Redux addresses that by creating one central repository where all the information is stored, and that is referred to as the store. So one central repository, one single store, and now each component can connect to it and use it. It provides for ways for component to connect and fetch data from the store, ways for component to interact with the store, and ways for stores to handle the effects of these actions. So one, we can connect to the store and fetch data. Second, if we want to update any data, interact with the store, we define actions. And also for these actions, the store should be able to handle the effect of these actions, which we refer to as reducers. These terms, actions, reducers, store, will become clearer as we go through this video and then look at a couple of examples. So there is a component, there is a store, and there is a reducer. In Redux, a component connects to the store for fetching data. So it will fetch data from the store as well as to update it. How does it update it? The component will dispatch an action to the store, and the store then uses something that we refer to as the reducer. It's an event handler, which then updates the store. So this is the broad architecture, and it will become clearer as we start using it. What are the steps to set up a Redux store? There are typically 5 steps to do it. Design the store, define the actions, define the reducer. So these are the 3 things: the store, design the store, define the actions, and define the reducer. Once we have done that, create the store and make it available. So the store is now available to the entire application, and then connect components to the store so that they can interact with the store, get data as well as dispatch actions to it. So these are the 5 steps. Let's look at each step in detail so that we understand it. The step 1 is design the store. The whole state of the application is stored inside a single store. So this is very important. In typical React applications, we have state within different components. In Redux, the whole state of the application is stored within one single central store. The store can be any data type, but usually it's a JavaScript object. So the whole state of the application is stored within this JavaScript object. So for example, there are initially 20 apples. When an apple is sold, the number of apples is suitably updated. Suppose we want to build an application wherein the number of apples are stored and we want to sell apples and keep on updating it. So then the store just is this JavaScript object, apples and the number of apples. So initially they are 20, so it is apples is 20. Next, what do we need to do? What's the second step? Define actions. So what do we mean by actions? Action is an event that describes something that happened in the application. Actions are plain JavaScript objects that have two parts. Type, a string signifying which event has happened. So it's like a name we give to an action, an event, and that string signifies the event that happened, and a payload, which means do we need any extra data to describe that action. So this payload is typically a JavaScript object. So here in this case, what we need to define is just a action sell, which means we have sold one apple. We don't need a payload because we sell one apple at a time, and type is sell. So this tells us that we have sold an apple. So this is a action. What is the third step? Define a reducer. So what do we mean by a reducer? Reducers are functions that take the current state and an action as arguments and return a new state result. So we have the state, we have an action, and reducer generates the new state based on the action. A very, very important aspect of state is that it cannot be modified directly. We create a new state based on the old state and modify that. So don't modify that state directly. Create a new state based on the old state. So in the example that we have been defining, we have an action type cell. So what is our reducer? It takes the state and the action. If action.type is cell, so if we are doing an action of type cell, it will return apples is state.apples minus 1. So it's created a new state. It did not modify the earlier one. It's otherwise it just returns the non-modified state, saying that this action did not affect the state. So that is how we define a reducer. This is a very simple reducer, but it starts giving us an idea. Next, what is the step? Step 4, create, store, and make it available. So we use createStore with the reducer. This creates a Redux store that holds the complete state of your app, and we should ensure that there should be only a single store in your app. So this is how we would define it. While we are using it, while we are developing our code, this will become clearer. The second part is to make it available. For that we use provider. Provider makes the Redux store available. Render a provider at the top level with the entire app's component tree inside it. So if we just put a provider and wrap all our components within that, then the store becomes available. Then what is step 5? Connect components to the store. So to connect components to the store, we use this function connect with a parameter mapStateToProps. So what does the connect function do? The connect function connects the component to the store and it provides it with two things: data it needs from the store to display or anything it wants to do with the data, and functions to dispatch actions to the store. To interact with the store, it provides us with functions to dispatch actions to the store. The parameter mapStateToProps, what does that do? It defines that part of the store that this component wants to access. So this is a powerful thing that whenever this part of the store changes, this component will get re-rendered. So here we define that part of the store that this component wants to access. So these are the 5 steps: design the store, define the actions, define the reducer, create store, make it available, and connect components to the store. So now we will go ahead and implement this simple application with Redux. There are initially 20 apples. We have a component wherein we have a button with cell, and when we click on cell, the number of apples gets reduced because it is updated. And we will use a Redux store for it. So here what we have is this main component.js where we have implemented exactly the same app. We have stored the apples as 20 in the state and we have created a cell button, which when we click it, it just updates the state of it. So if we run it and if we click cell, it will obviously update it. Now what do we want to do? Instead of using it through state here, we want to use Redux. So let's start following the steps. What are the steps to it? We will go to the first step. We will design the store. So here we have created a file reducer.js where we will design the store and define our reducer. So let's define what is our store. So initial state is equal to, and like we defined in our apples is 20. So that is our initial state. Once we have designed our store, what's the next thing? We want to define our actions. So what are our actions here? So our actions in this case is one action, which is type equal to cell. That is the single action that we have. So now we need to define a reducer for it. So we can just say const reducer equal to, it takes the state, and if the state is not defined, we will just provide it the initial state, which is this. So this is defaulting to the initial state and the action. And then what do we do? Let's say we put in a console.log to see when this is getting called. In reducer state is state and action is action. So we'll just get a console.log. Next, what do we need to do? If action.type is equal to cell. So if this is our action, then what do we need to do? We will return the new modified state, and what that would be, apples is state dot apples minus 1. Else what do we want to do? We will just return the state. So this is our reducer that we have defined here. Next, with that we have defined a reducer, we need to connect it to the app and make it available. So for that we will go to our index.js and make the following changes in the index.js. First, we will need to import createStore from Redux. So just do these imports. Then we need to import provider from react-redux. Next, we will import the reducer that we defined, reducer from, and in this case it was in components/reducer. reducer. So this is the reducer we defined, so we are importing it. So these are the three imports. Next, what do we want to do? We will use createStore. So const store is equal to createStore with the reducer. So we have created the store with this reducer. Next, we need to wrap all of them with the provider. So let's do that. The main component. So provider store is equal to store, and we wrap it. So we have wrapped the main component. There is a single component here, but the main component would provide the hierarchy to it. We have wrapped it in the provider. So we have made it available. Next, what do we need to do? In our main component, we will now need to connect it to the store. So how do we connect this component to the store? So first, let's import connect from react-redux. So once we have imported connect, let's go to our here and we use connect. So connect, we pass it mapStateToProps. We will define it in a minute, and then we pass it the main component. So once we have done that, let's define our const mapStateToProps. What does this do? It takes the state and it will return the part of the state that this component wants to use. So return, in this case, we will use the whole state dot apples. So this is our mapStateTo part. Now, once we have defined it, we'll need to define our actions. So let's define our actions. We have one action. Let's call it, say, sell action. And what does it return? It returns JSON. Now, what's the JSON it returns? Type is sell. That was the string. So we have now defined our action. So once we have defined our action, let's now integrate it. So where do we integrate it? So in our this.cell, we don't need the local state. So let's delete that. And now instead of using the this.state here, how do we define it? We will define it as this.props.dispatch cell action. So now what do? On a cell, we just dispatch this action. So we use the props.dispatch and dispatch this action. Next, we also need to be able to show these states here. So the number of apples. So how do we get the apples? So we don't have it here. So we will now say this.props.apples. So what does mapStateToProps do? It has mapped this into our props. So in our props, we now get this apples and we are displaying it. And whenever we have this action, we will just go ahead and dispatch it. Let's test it now. Expected this to be a function. So we have an error here. Let's fix that. So most likely the error is because we did not export our reducer. So when we used it, we got that error. So let's test it again. And now this is working fine. So this is the step we had missed. We had not exported our reducer. So in our index.js, when we use the reducer, when we were importing it, we were not able to do that. So now this is the first time this app has come over. So now you can see this thing in reducer. State is this apples 20, and the action we have received is, so this is the action we received, the init action, the first time the create store was used. Where was the create store used? In our index.js, we called the create store with the reducer. So this is the first time. Next, now if I click on sell button, we have gotten an object an error. Actions must be plain objects. What error did we do here in defining our action? So let's go to our main component. So we needed to call this function. We did not put these parentheses. That was the error. Let's test it again. So now when I click on cell, you can see we get 19. So in reducer state, when we call that function, the apples is 20 and we get this action type is cell. And we are getting it here. Let's make a couple of changes here. Suppose we do not define this mapStateToProps.states. So we just define the connect here. Now what happens? Let's test it. So we don't get the values of the props. We are able to dispatch the actions, but we are not able to display it here. So if we want to access that state, we will need to put the mapStateToProps, and we are getting it here. So this is the simple application that we have created, wherein notice here we do not have a state in our main component. All the state comes from our reducer and we are able to use it. Next, what do we do? Let's add another action buy. So whenever we click on buy, one apple gets bought. So how would we now add that action? So the first step is, let's go to our actions here. We have another action now. What will that action say? It is type equal to buy. So let's handle that. So if we get that action, else if action dot type is equal to buy, then what do we return? Apples will be state dot apples plus 1. That's what it would become. So we have now defined our action. Once we have defined our action, let's go to the main component. So in our main component, like we defined a sell action, let's define a buy action. So what would buy action be? Its type is buy. So that's the string we are sending. Next, we will need to define a dispatch. So let's do that. Buy is equal to dispatch. What do we want to dispatch? The buy action. Remember to put these parentheses. Now just like this, let's add another button here and let's call that button buy. And on that, what do we call? We call buy. So this is what we have done. Let's go ahead and test it. So we have now the sell and the buy, and the state has been set up. Now if I click on buy, so in reducer, we have gotten the state and now the action is buy. And once we get that action, you can see the apples have become 21, 22, 23. We are being able to do it. Now if I sell, so from 24, they become 23 and the action type is sell. And this is now absolutely fine. Next, what do we want to do? Add a payload to the action. So in buy, we also have a payload, which is quantity. So that payload is a JSON, and that JSON has one field quantity with the quantity there. So the amount of quantity that we get in the payload, that is what we want to use. So let's go back to our reducer. So now in this case, we get a payload. So instead of apples being state.apples plus 1, this will be action dot payload dot quantity. That's the structure. Let's go back and check it again. So action dot payload dot quantity. So we add that here. So this would be the change. That's how we have used the payload. And now in the main component, let's define say 2 buy buttons. Let's also define, let's call this say buy 1 and this say buy 5. We passed as parameter here So this is the change. Next, we want to give this action. We'll need to modify the action. How do we modify the action? Type is by, payload is, quantity is this value that we passed. So this would be the JSON now. Type is by and payload would have this quantity with this value. Now here we get this value quantity, which is what we're getting here, 1 or 5, and then we call this by action with this quantity. Once we call this by action with this quantity, it returns this JSON which gets dispatched. Now let's test it. So we have cell by 1 by 5, the state is set up. Let's click on by 5. So now this has become 25. In the reducer we got state apples is 20, and what did we get in action? We got type is by and payload with action with quantity as 5. If I click on by 1, this is perfect, and if I click on cell, you can see there is no payload and we are handling it. So here we have sent a payload also. So this is a very simple app wherein we used Redux. We set up a very simple store, a very simple set of actions. Go through this application, just try and make it twice and thrice, make those 5 action steps. What are the steps we want? So these are the 5 steps: design store, define actions, define reducer, create store, make it available, connect components to the store. If you start just following this process, it will start becoming very clear to it. So my suggestion would be just try and make this application a couple of times on your own. If you want to add, just add maybe at the end of it a simple functionality if you want to add it, and see if you are able to implement that action again, that functionality, that action, maybe see if you can do that.